The autumn her father was buried, Rachel Vane discovered that a mining viewer leaves his daughter one true inheritance, and it is not his instruments, which the creditors took, nor his book debts, which she paid to the last farthing because he would have wished it, but his eye, the particular trained eye that reads a hillside the way other women read a psalter, seeing water where the grass grows too green and old workings where the ground has settled by no more than the width of 2 fingers. And it very nearly did not save her at all. She was 24 that September. A tall, clear-eyed young woman with dark brown hair she wore in a plain, low knot, and a level, unhurried way of looking at a person that unsettled men who expected a woman to look away first. And she had spent every one of those years at her father's elbow in the coal country of the north, in a stone house at the edge of a pit village, with a man named Thomas Vane who had been a mining viewer for 30 years, who could read a scene the way other men read weather, and who had, having no son and no money, for a governess who would only have taught her sampler work, simply made his daughter into the son he needed, so that Rachel Vane could run a level, work a dial, keep a set of underground bearings in her head across 400 fathoms of black gallery, and read the crabbed, abbreviated notation of 40 years of colliery plans as easily as other young women read a milliner's bill. What she could not do, she found, standing in the emptied house a month after the funeral while her father's own former employer's agent picked over the surveying instruments and named a sum for the whole that would not have covered the interest on what was owed, was persuade the world that any of this had value in a woman. She had written after every post she heard of: assistant viewer, colliery clerk, plan copyist, and had received in return either silence or letters of chilly astonishment that a female should put herself forward for such work. And by the last week of September she had sold the instruments and the good clock and her mother's small brooch, had paid her father's debts to the last shilling, and had counted what remained, and found it came to a little under £7, which is not a large sum to stand between a young woman and the workhouse, whatever the engineers may say about the dignity of useful knowledge. It was her father's own old master of all men who saved her, and he did it with a single sheet of mining trade paper. Mr. Ezra Coldwell had been chief viewer of half the pits in the county in his day, and was long retired to a narrow house in Durham with his rheumatism and his memories. And he had loved Thomas Vane as the best pupil he ever trained. And when he heard of the death, he wrote to the daughter he had met perhaps 4 times in her life, a short letter of real feeling, and one piece of hard news besides, that there was a notice going the rounds of the colliery agents that a great estate in the north was seeking a person qualified to survey a flooded working and prepare fresh plans for the mines inspectorate, that the terms were generous because the ordinary sort of man would not touch the work, and that the pit in question was the Ashcombe pit, and the master of Ashcombe was the Duke of Ashcombe, and there was not a viewer, a deputy, or a coal agent between the Tyne and the Wear who would go under that ground willingly, because the Duke of Ashcombe, as everybody in the coal field knew, had let his own pit stand unpumped and unpropped to save the price of new engines, until the old flooded workings broke through 18 months before and drowned 13 men where they stood. Rachel read the notice twice by candlelight, and then she went the next morning to Durham and sat in Mr. Coldwell's small parlor and asked him, in the level voice her father had always said would serve her better than beauty, though she did not lack that either, what precisely everybody in the coal field knew, and how they had come to know it. And the old man, discovering with some surprise that he was being examined by a girl he still half remembered in short skirts, told her the story as the whole coalfield told it. The story that had run down every rope walk and public house from Newcastle to the Tees for a year and 8 months. The Duke of Ashcombe had inherited, at 8 and 20, a pit his own father had sunk on borrowed money, and had worked it hard, and worked it, by the reckoning of most who dealt with him, fairly, paying the standard rate and keeping a school for the pit children and a doctor on retainer for the village. And the pit had prospered, and the Duke had prospered with it, until 2 years before the disaster his agent, a sharp, capable man named Absalom Creed, who had managed the colliery for a decade and was trusted absolutely, had come to him with the figures for a new pumping engine to clear the old northern workings sunk by the Duke's grandfather and abandoned these 60 years, and believed to be standing full of water behind a barrier of solid coal. Left for that very purpose, and the sum named had been very large, and the Duke, new to the business and trusting his agent's judgment on every point but this one, had said that the barrier had held 60 years and would hold 60 more, and that the money was better spent on new houses for the Pitt families, and had signed no order for the engine, and 18 months before, in the middle of a November night shift, the barrier had given way without the smallest warning, and the old black water had come down the workings faster than a man could run, and 13 men had drowned in the dark before the alarm even reached the bank. Not one word of excuse, Mr. Coldwell said, with the particular grimness of a man who had spent his whole life underground and took such matters to heart, though the inspector's inquiry had asked him outright why the engine had been refused, and the county coroner had all but set it for the newspapers that would print it. The Duke had shut half the hall, dismissed the very agent whose figures he had overruled, quarreled, it was said, with half his own family over the money he now spent without limit on the widows and the orphans of the 13, and had lived these 20 months alone above his own drowned pit, like a man standing guard over a grave he had dug himself, seeing no society, giving no dinners. Walking the pit bank at first light in all weathers, with his hat in his hand as if the place were a church, and the coal field, which had buried 13 of its own sons and brothers and fathers in one November week, had passed its verdict without troubling any jury, and the verdict was in the black bunting that the pit village had never quite taken down. And he pays double the ordinary fee, Mr. Coldwell finished, folding the notice away, because he must, for no viewer in the county will set foot in those workings for love or money, and they say the plans have not been touched since the flood, because no one has been found brave enough or hungry enough to go down and draw them fresh. And I tell you plainly, my dear, I would not send a son of mine, if God had given me one, into that pit for double the fee twice over. Rachel thanked him, kept the notice, and sat that evening in the narrow spare room he had given her, with her father's own drawing instruments, saved from the sale by Mr. Coldwell's quiet intervention, laid out before her on the table, and considered her position with the unsentimental clarity that poverty teaches quicker than any school. She had £7, no family, no protector, and one skill the world would not buy from a woman above ground, and here at last was a door standing open below it. And if there was a disaster behind that door, the disaster paid double wages, and she had never yet met the working that frightened her more than the workhouse did. She wrote her letter that night, setting out her father's name and her own long apprenticeship at his side, and signing herself, after an hour's deliberation, R. Vane, which was not a falsehood, but was not the whole truth either. And 11 days later there came back a single sheet, sealed in black wax with a crest of a wheel and 3 thorns, informing R. Vane in a steward's plain hand that the position was offered at £120 for the season with board found, that the survey was to be completed and sworn before the mines inspector by the following Lady Day, and that a conveyance would meet the Durham coach at the market town of Ashcombe Denay on the first Monday of the month. There was no question in the letter of interviews, or of character, or of anything at all, except whether R. Vane could begin at once, and Rachel understood from that correctly that she was very likely the only applicant, and pushed the understanding to the back of her mind, where it sat quietly beside the story of the flood all the way north. The journey took 2 days, the second of them through country that changed by the mile from Greendale to Black Coalfield, hedgerows giving way to slag banks and winding wheels standing black against the sky, until the coach set her down at dusk in a gray stone market town, where the church bell was tolling for some ordinary evening service, and a closed gig stood waiting with a groom who did not smile, and the innkeeper's wife, seeing where her box was being carried, looked at Rachel with something between pity and curiosity, and said only, "Well, you'll be for the hall then, and God send you better luck than the last that went." The gig climbed for the better part of an hour, past cottages hung, here and there, still with black creep gone gray with weather at the window, past a pit bank where a single lamp burned though the shift was long done, past a squat stone chapel with a new-cut monument standing white and raw among the older gray stones, until the road turned, and Ashcombe Hall stood up against the last light of the sky. Not a fairy palace, but a long, hard-shouldered house of blackened stone, coal-grimed by 2 centuries of its own smoke, with a headstock and a winding wheel visible beyond the near park wall, the pit and the great house standing eye to eye across a 1/4 mile of turf, as though neither could look away from the other. And Rachel, who had promised herself she would not be impressed, felt instead something colder and more serious settle over her. Because a house that keeps its own grief in full view of its own windows is a different thing from a house merely old. She was received in a stone-flagged hall by the housekeeper, a spare, upright woman of some 60 years in black bombazine with keys at her waist and a face schooled to give nothing away, who introduced herself as Mrs. Prentice, looked once hard at Rachel's plain traveling dress and once harder at the case of drawing instruments she carried herself and would let no porter touch, and said, without preamble, "So you are the new surveyor?" And when Rachel said that she was, Mrs. Prentice was silent a moment and then said, "Well, it is not my place to say what I think of sending a young woman down that ground, and His Grace has been told, and you are to stay. So I will say instead what I say to everyone who comes into this house, and you will do me the kindness of hearing it as law. You will keep to the estate office and the plans room and your own chamber. You will not go down the pit without His Grace's own leave and a deputy beside you. You will not speak of the 14th of November to any soul in this house or this village, not to me, not to the grooms, not to anyone, not one word, for there is not a family for 5 miles that did not bury someone that week, and grief that is spoken of carelessly here is grief that turns to anger fast. And above all, you will not speak to His Grace unless His Grace speaks first. And if you keep those rules faithfully, you will find this a quiet, fair, well-fed place. And if you break them, you will be on the Durham coach inside the week, wondering what you did." She said it without cruelty, the way a woman recites a catechism she has recited too often to hear anymore. And then she took up a lamp and led Rachel through corridors where dust sheets covered half the furniture and every clock in the house. Rachel noticed before she could stop herself noticing, stood at 20 minutes past 2, to a small clean room with a good fire and a window that looked. When she drew back the curtain later that night, directly down upon the black bulk of the pit bank and its one burning lamp, and left her there with the observation that supper would come up on a tray and that the estate office would be shown to her at 8. Rachel Vane sat down on the bed when the door closed, allowed herself, for exactly 5 minutes by her father's own watch, saved from the sale like the instruments to be afraid, and then unpacked her box, set her father's dial upon the table like a flag planted on foreign ground, and went to bed within sound, for the first time in her life, of a pit she had not yet seen and already half understood. The estate office, when Mrs. Prentice showed it to her in the gray light of the next morning, was a long, low room at the end of the stable wing, and it drove every other thought out of Rachel's head for the better part of a day, which a kinder providence might have arranged on purpose. Plans hung in tiers upon every wall, generations of them, her own trade's whole history laid out in tracing cloth and hand-tinted wash, the old shallow workings of the Duke's grandfather in faded ochre, the deeper drivages of the Duke's father in a harder black ink, and rolled upon the long table waiting for her, the last plan anyone had troubled to make, dated the autumn before the flood, in a fine, confident, close hand she did not yet know for Absalom Creed's, and beside it, waiting also, a locked deed box of underground reports going back 60 years that nobody, Mrs. Prentice said, had opened since the water came in, because the surveyor who alone had the right to open it had gone to Newcastle within the fortnight and had not been heard of since. Rachel stood among the 60 years of her own craft and felt a particular clean joy that had nothing to do with the grief of the house, and then she rolled up her sleeves, figuratively speaking, for she was as careful of her actual cuffs as her father had ever been, and went to work. For 9 days the house kept its word and was quiet, and she kept hers and asked no questions, and she did not so much as see the Duke of Ashcombe, though she learned his geography the way one learns weather, that he walked out to the pit bank before it was light in every kind of morning, that he dined alone at 8 at the foot of a table laid, by his own unvarying order, for one, and that his step could be heard some nights very late, crossing the yard below her window toward the engine house, slow and even, as though he were counting something with his feet. The 2 housemaids, village girls who came in and out of her orbit with coal and trays, were friendly within the limits Mrs. Prentice's law allowed, and from them Rachel gathered the shape of the household, that the butler, Mr. Yardley, had served the Duke's father and would hear no word against the family though he never smiled, that half the pensions in the village were paid quietly out of the Duke's own pocket over and above what any law required, that his grace was not unkind. They wished to say that plainly he remembered every widow's name and had stood godfather, before the flood, to more than one collier's child, but that he carried about him a stillness that was worse than a temper, so that a room got quieter when he came into it and stayed quieter after he left, and that no neighboring family had dined at Ashcombe Hall in 20 months, and that the ballroom under its dust sheets on the far side of the house was as dark as the pit itself. There was also, they told her, dropping their voices though there was no one to hear, the young master, Edwin, the Duke's only child, a boy of 8 who had been a merry, noisy little creature before the flood and who had, since it, stopped seeking out the village boys who used to be his whole world, because 3 of those boys had lost their fathers in one night and would not now play with the son of the man the county blamed for it, and the boy, not understanding money or barriers or pumping engines, only understanding that his particular friends had gone cold and strange to him and that his own father had gone silent and gray, had concluded, in the plain brutal logic of a child, that he himself must somehow be at fault, and had grown watchful and quiet in a house already too full of both. On the 10th day Rachel met the Duke, and it was not, as she had half expected, in any hall or library, but out of doors, before 6 in the morning, when she had risen early to walk the near ground above the workings and get the lie of the surface into her own feet before she trusted it on paper, and had come over the shoulder of the pit bank into a thin mist to find a tall man standing quite still at the edge of the old quarry ground where the shaft head stood, his hat in his hand though the morning was raw, looking down at the black wet mouth of the engine house the way another man might look at a grave. And she stopped, not wishing to intrude on what was plainly a daily observance, but a lump of loose spoil turned under her boot. And he heard her, and turned, and for a moment they regarded one another across 20 feet of wet grass, and then he came toward her, and she made her curtsy, and waited, as the law required, to be spoken to. The Duke of Ashcombe was 35 that autumn, and Rachel, who had constructed out of coalfield gossip and her own misgivings something between a miser and a murderer, was obliged to dismantle the construction on the spot, which annoyed her, because he was, in the plain arithmetic of the thing, a tall, spare, hard-handed man who looked less like a duke than like the best sort of working viewer, sunburned where the weather had got at him, with black hair going gray a little at the temple, a face that would have been called fine anywhere, straight-browed, gray-eyed, and every line of it locked, not fierce, not cruel, simply locked, the way a shaft head is locked when the engine has stopped for good. And he looked at her for a moment that stretched, and then said, in a voice that was quiet and even and gave exactly as much away as the face, "You are the new surveyor." It was not a question, and there was nothing in it Rachel could have complained of to anyone. And yet the flatness of it stung her somewhere her poverty had made tender, and so instead of the "yes, your grace" that Mrs. Prentice's catechism prescribed, she heard herself say, "I am, your grace, and I have been over your father's plans and your grandfather's this fortnight, and I will tell you plainly there is more sense in this ground than in most of what is said about it in Durham." The words were out before Prudence could catch them, and in the small silence that followed she had time to see the Durham coach, and the workhouse at the end of it quite clearly, and then the Duke of Ashcombe looked at her for a longer moment than before, and said what is said about it in Durham, and she told him, because there seemed no profit in a lie to a man who would only hear the truth from someone else by nightfall, that it was said he had let his own men drown to save the cost of an engine, and the Duke's face did not change at all, which told her more than a wince would have, and he said only, "And what do you think?" having read the ground. And Rachel, who had not yet earned the right to an opinion and knew it, said carefully that she had not yet been below, and that a surface reading and an underground one were different trades entirely, but that she had noticed that the old plan showed the barrier at a thickness her own father would have called generous, and that generous barriers did not commonly fail of themselves. And the Duke stood very still at that, in the wet grass with his hat still in his hand, and said, at last, in a voice that had changed by some small degree she could not name, "My agent told me the barrier was sound. He told me so a fortnight before it broke, when I asked him myself whether the old workings wanted watching, and he laughed at me for asking, and I believed him, because I had trusted his figures on every other point for 10 years, and had no cause then to doubt this one, and I have had 2 years since to wonder whether I trusted him because his figures were good, or because it was easier then, doing the arithmetic myself, and there was something in the way he said it, some minute unlocking about the mouth, that told Rachel Vane 2 things at once. First, that the barrier and the ground beneath her feet mattered to this man in some way that went a good deal further than money, as a thing he meant to understand if it took the rest of his life. And second, that whatever the coalfield said in its tap rooms, the coalfield had, at the very least, never stood in this wet field at 6 a.m. and watched this man look at his own drowned pit the way a father looks at a sickbed. And it was on the strength of that look, though she did not admit it to herself for weeks, that Rachel Vane first began, privately, in the disorderly bottom drawer of her own tidy mind, to doubt the Coalfields' verdict. After that morning, the Duke came, now and again, to the estate office in the evenings, not often at first, and never with any acknowledgement that a habit was forming. And he would stand at the far end of the long table with a candle and look at whatever section of the old plans she had unrolled, and for a long while they did not speak much at all beyond the plain business of the ground, and Rachel, who understood better than most that there are partnerships whose whole value lies in their silences, worked at her end and let him be. It was the second week of October before the silence began, here and there, to leak. It leaked first through the plans themselves, because he could not long watch her reading his grandfather's abbreviated notation without asking what a mark meant. And his questions were the questions of a man who had spent 10 years being handed conclusions instead of workings, and had begun, too late for his own peace of mind, to want the workings. And answering them was like laying a level, patient and exact, and Rachel had not had anyone ask her a serious question about her own trade since her father died, and she discovered that she had missed it the way she would have missed bread. And once, when she showed him that his grandfather's own hand, on the oldest plan of all, had noted the barrier's thickness in a column the later surveyors had stopped troubling to copy across, a column that gave a figure smaller by a third than the one his own agent had quoted him, the Duke of Ashcombe went very quiet, and then said, "Lo, that is not the figure I was given." And Rachel said, "No, your grace, it is not." And neither of them said anything further that night. But she saw him carry the thought away with him like a man carrying a lit coal in his bare hand, careful not to let it show and unable to set it down. She met the boy by accident, as the best meetings always happen, on a wet afternoon in the third week of October, when a fault in the office chimney had smoked her out of her own work, and she had carried her tracing cloth and her father's small brass rule into the disused morning room to catch the last of the light, and had found there, folded into the window seat with his knees drawn up, a thin, dark-haired child of about 8 who went rigid at the sight of her the way a rabbit goes rigid, all stillness and no retreat, and said nothing at all, and Rachel, who had learned patience from 400 fathoms of black gallery, if she had learned it from nothing else, did not speak to him either, but sat herself down at the far end of the window seat with a full arm's length between them, and unrolled a fragment of an old plan, and began, to herself half aloud, to work out a bearing, murmuring the figures the way her father used to murmur them, not to the boy, not to anyone, simply because that was how the sums came right. She did this for the better part of an hour, and the boy watched her sidelong the whole while with the fierce covert attention of a child who has decided that grown people are not to be trusted with his notice, and it was not until she took out, for the pleasure of it, a small brass model of a winding wheel her father had made her as a girl, no bigger than a snuff box, with a little crank that turned a spindle and a thread that would wind up a thimble as a real wheel winds up a corve, that the boy's stillness broke, and he said, in a small rusty voice that sounded unused, "Does it truly work?" And Rachel said, gravely, that it did, and let him turn the crank and watched the thimble climb, and said, because it seemed the true thing to say and not merely the kind one, "Your own pit has a wheel 1,000 times this size, and it works the very same way. Only there is a man at the top who watches the rope instead of a girl watching a thimble." And the boy's face, at the word pit, went through a whole complicated country of feeling in the space of a breath, want and fear and grief all at once. And he said, "Lo, my father goes there every morning before it is light." And Rachel said, "Yes, I have seen him." And the boy said, "Is he looking for the men?" And Rachel, who understood that a child's questions are never as simple as their words, said carefully, "I think he goes to remember them," which is a thing grown people do at gravesides. And the boy considered this with the terrible gravity of the very young, and then said, "Sam says his father is in the black water still, and nobody has fetched him up." And Rachel understood then, in one cold stroke, that the boy carried inside him not merely a grief of his own, but the whole village's grief turned back upon him through the mouths of children too young to spare him. And she said, gently, that some of the men below could not be fetched up, and that this was a true sorrow and not any person's fault, not Sam's father's and not the Duke's either. Sorrow of that kind coming sometimes to a house the way weather comes, without anybody's asking. And the boy looked at her for a long moment with his father's own gray eyes, and then, unprompted, put his small hand flat on the little brass wheel, not turning it, just resting it there, the way a person rests a hand on a thing that has given comfort. And after that the morning room became, without anyone's arranging it, a place where Rachel Vane and Edwin, Marquess of some courtesy title nobody in the nursery troubled to use, sat together most wet afternoons, she at her plans and he at his models, and the household noticed and said nothing, because the household had begun, cautiously, to hope. It was in the first week of November that Absalom Creed came back to Ashcombe Hall. He came in a good gig of his own, for he had done well enough in the 2 years since his dismissal to keep one, a well-made, smiling man of about 47, with sandy hair gone mostly gray, an easy-carrying voice, and the particular glossy confidence of a man who has never once in his life doubted that he would land on his feet. And Rachel, crossing the stable yard with a chain and a bundle of pegs for a survey line, saw Mr. Yardley's back go rigid at the door the way a dog's hackles rise before its master has said a word, and heard the change come over the house the way one hears a note go wrong in a hymn. And the Duke came out of the estate office and stood in the yard, and the two men looked at each other with a stillness that was not a quarrel, being a good deal colder and older than any quarrel. And Creed said, with his easy smile quite undisturbed, that he had heard his Grace had a new surveyor in, and had thought it only neighborly, having managed the pit 10 years himself, to offer what assistance an old servant of the family could still give, seeing as the inspectorate's date drew near, and a wrong plan sworn to a government officer was a grave matter for any gentleman. And the Duke said, evenly, "You were paid what was owed you, and you were told not to come back." And Creed spread his hands and said that a man might surely be forgiven a little natural anxiety for a pit he had given the best years of his working life to, and that he had, as it happened, heard a curious tale in Newcastle only the week before, that the new surveyor was going about saying the old barrier had been thicker on paper than the figures he himself had given his Grace, which he was sure was some misunderstanding of a young person new to the ground, for he had surveyed that barrier himself not 5 years past, and would swear before any inspector in England to its dimensions. And his eyes, while he said this, went once, briefly, past the Duke's shoulder to where Rachel stood with her chain over her arm, a look that lasted no longer than a blink and told her a very great deal, because it was not the look of an innocent man mildly corrected. It was the look of a man taking the measure of an enemy. And Rachel, who had spent her whole life reading what the ground did not say aloud, understood in that one glance that Mr. Absalom Creed already knew to the inch what she had found in the old plans, which meant somebody in that house was carrying her work to him, and that he had driven out from Newcastle the same week he heard it, not out of neighborliness, but out of the particular haste of a man who has just learned that a thing he buried is being dug up. The Duke said only that his surveyor would swear to what the ground itself told her, and to nothing else, and that Mr. Creed's assistance was not wanted. And Creed, unruffled, said that he quite understood, that grief made gentlemen say all manner of things they did not mean, and got back into his good gig and drove away down the avenue as easily as a man leaving a call he has enjoyed. And it was that ease, more than anything he had said, that decided Rachel. That night she went to the Duke in the estate office and told him, plainly, what she had seen in Creed's face, and said that a man with nothing to hide does not drive 40 miles the week he hears his old figures are being questioned, and that she could no longer content herself with reading old plans on a table, that the ground above could only tell her so much, and that if the barrier had truly been thinner than Mr. Creed swore, the only witness left who could say so for certain was the barrier itself, wherever the water had left it standing, and that she must go down. The Duke refused her outright, the first time, in a voice gone hard with something that was not anger, but was very near it, said that he had signed away 13 men on the strength of another person's confident figures once already, and would not sign away a 14th life on the strength of his own daughter's misplaced trust in a woman 4 months in his employ. And Rachel, who had expected exactly this, did not argue with his fear, being too honest a woman to pretend she did not share a version of it herself, but she laid before him instead, the following evening, the whole of what a proper descent required: a deputy who knew the workings above the flood line, a safety lamp of the newest pattern, a fixed hour and a fixed rope signal, and a man at the bank who would haul on that signal if it were not renewed within it. And she said that her own father had gone below 1,000 times with no more protection than this, and had died, in the end, of an ordinary winter fever in his own bed, which was a better death than the coal field generally allowed a viewer, and that she had not crossed 2 counties and buried her only parent to sit in a warm office copying figures she could not trust, when the truth or the falsehood of 10 years' management lay 40 fathoms under her own feet, waiting only for somebody willing to go and look at it. It was Edwin, in the end, who tipped the scale, though he never knew it, for he came into the estate office that same evening looking for his brass wheel, which he had taken to leaving there, and found his father and the surveyor standing over the old plan in a silence that even a child could feel was an argument. And he looked at the plan, and then at Rachel, and said, with the plain, fearless logic of 8 years old, "Are you going to find out if it was really my father's fault?" And Rachel said that she meant to try. And the boy turned to his father and said, "Then let her. Because Sam says everybody knows it was. And I don't think everybody knows anything. I think everybody just says it." And the Duke of Ashcombe looked down at his son for a long moment, and something in his locked face gave way that had not given way to any argument of Rachel's, and he said, at last, very low, very well, "Miss Vane, you shall go down, and God forgive me if I am wrong to let you." The deputy chosen to go with her was a broad, slow-spoken man named Davy Otley, who had worked the Ashcombe seam since he was a boy of 10 and had been on the bank, not below. The night of the flood, sent up an hour before with a lamed pony and so spared by nothing but chance, a sparing he had carried since like a debt he did not know how to discharge, and Rachel liked him at once for the plain, unhurried way he checked her lamp twice and her rope signal 3 times before he would let her so much as approach the cage, and for the fact that he called her Miss Vane and not lass or lady, as a man speaks to a fellow tradesman, and not as a man speaks to a curiosity. They went down on a still, cold morning in the middle of November, a year almost to the week since the flood, with the Duke himself standing at the pit bank in his shirt sleeves overseeing the rope as if his own 2 eyes on it could hold it steady. And the descent was nothing Rachel had not done 100 times at her father's side, and yet the fathoms fell away that day with a weight she had not felt before, because every wet, gleaming yard of timbering they passed was a yard where 13 men had once walked to their work and not walked back. And Davy Otley, swinging his lamp low, named 2 or 3 of them to her without her asking, quietly, the way a man leaves flowers. This were Willem Strother's stall, and this were where the young Otterburn lad worked the trapdoor, and Rachel understood that she was not merely surveying a working. She was walking through a graveyard that happened to be roofed in stone. They went first to the old plan's own marks, following her father's trained eye and the faded ochre lines she had copied out by heart, until the roadway narrowed and Davy Otley's lamp showed her, at last, the place where the barrier had stood, a great broken gap now, black and dripping. The coal on either face torn and slumped where the water had gone through it, and Rachel set down her instruments and made herself look at it as a tradeswoman and not as a mourner, running her light along the torn face inch by inch the way her father had taught her to read a wound in the ground, and it was Davy Otley, not she, who saw it first, because his eye, though untrained in her particular science, had 40 years of that same rock in it, and he put his broad hand flat against a section of the standing coal some yards back from the worst of the breach, and said, "Lo, Miss Vane, come and look at this, for I mind this face from before, and it were never worked so near the old water, not in my time." And Rachel came and held her lamp close, and saw what he meant, that the coal here had been cut away in a clean, recent, deliberate line, the pick marks fresh and unweathered, where every other face in that old gallery was rounded and blackened, with decades of damp, a narrow-driven heading, timbered with new wood that still showed the pale, unweathered grain of a tree felled within the last 2 or 3 years, running straight from the worked seam toward the very heart of where the barrier had stood. And she understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the cold of the workings, that she was not looking at a barrier that had failed of age or of a miscalculation made honestly 10 years before. She was looking at a barrier that had been driven into, on purpose, by men with picks and new timber, sometime within the 2 or 3 years before the flood, cut thin from the inside where no surface reading and no old plan could ever have shown it, so that it looked whole and sound to any eye that did not go below, and stood, from the plan room, exactly the thickness Absalom Creed had always sworn it to be. Davy Otley, holding his lamp with a hand that shook a very little now, said that he minded, the autumn 2 years back, being taken off his usual rounds for the best part of a fortnight, and set instead to timbering a new stable range above ground, and being told it was Mr. Creed's own order, and that 2 strange men, not regular Ashcombe hands, had been brought in that same fortnight and set below with no deputy over them but Creed himself, which was not the custom, for no agent went below without a deputy at his elbow unless he had particular reason not to want witnesses, and Davy Otley said he had thought it strange at the time, and had said nothing, because a collier who questions his agent's orders is a collier looking for his notice, and a man with 4 children does not go looking for his notice, and he had put it out of his mind until this moment, standing in the driven heading with her lamp on the fresh-cut coal. And now he could not put it out of his mind at all, and he said, his voice gone rough, "If that were done a purpose, Miss Vane." Then Creed knew what he were about, and 13 men are dead of his knowing, and Rachel Vane, standing 40 fathoms under her own feet in a black gallery with a frightened deputy and a lamp that showed her the truth at last, said only that they would take nothing on trust, that a driven heading and a deputy's memory were a beginning and not an end, and that she meant to measure the whole of it, the length, the bearing, the timber, before ever she said a word to the Duke, because a scrupulous surveyor does not carry a suspicion to a grieving man, she carries a certainty, and it took her the better part of 3 hours, with Davy Otley holding the lamp steady and naming what he remembered, to run her chain the length of the driven heading and take its bearing and note the timber's growth against the old props on either side. And when she came up at last into the gray November daylight, black to the elbows and shaking with a cold that was not only the cold of the workings, the Duke of Ashcombe was still standing exactly where she had left him at the pit bank, having not moved, she understood, the whole 3 hours. And he came to her before Davy Otley had even got the cage chained off, and searched her face and said, low, urgent, "What did you find?" And Rachel Vane, looking up at him with her own face streaked with coal dust and something that was not coal dust besides, said, "Your Grace, I found that the barrier did not fail. I found that a man cut through it on purpose, 2 years before the water came, with hired hands and new timber, and hid the cut where no plan and no eye above ground could ever have shown it to you, and I believe, though I cannot yet prove the whole of it, that the man who ordered that cutting is the same man who swore to you, in this very yard, not a fortnight since, that he would stake his character on the barrier's soundness." And the Duke of Ashcombe stood very still in the cold morning light, with the news breaking over him the way the flood itself must once have broken over the men below. And then he did a thing Rachel had not expected and would not forget. He did not ask her twice, and he did not doubt her. He put both his coal-blackened hands over his face for the length of perhaps 10 seconds. And when he took them away, his eyes were wet, and his voice, when it came, was not a duke's voice at all. It was the voice of a man laying down a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten it could be set down. And he said, "Then it was not my parsimony that killed them." And Rachel said gently, "No, Your Grace. It was a thief's greed, and I think I begin to see what he was greedy for." And the Duke said, "Tell me." And she said that a driven heading cut 2 years before the flood, straight and deliberate, aimed at nothing the old plans showed, was not the work of a man testing a barrier's strength. It was the work of a man going somewhere, and that she meant to find out where. But that she would stake her father's good name, that it led to coal nobody else in this county knew this. Pitt possessed. That evening, for the first time since she had come to Ashcombe, the Duke of Ashcombe sat late in the estate office, not to watch her work, but to talk, low and unguarded, of the 10 years he had trusted Absalom Creed absolutely, of the friendship he had believed lay under the figures, of the particular, specific horror of learning that a grief he had carried as his own fault. Walked to the pit bank with every morning for 20 months, hat in hand like a mourner at his own trial, had been manufactured, cut into the rock itself, by a man he had called friend. And Rachel, listening the way her father had taught her to listen to a difficult text, for what is present but not stated, understood that she was watching a man's whole architecture of guilt come down, plank by plank, and be replaced, not with peace, not yet, but with something far more dangerous to a duke's composure, which was anger, clean and cold and entirely deserved. And she found, sitting at her end of the table with her hands still faintly black at the knuckle from the day's work, that she loved him, had perhaps loved him since the wet gray morning at the pit bank when he told her his agent's figures and not his own thrift had killed his men. And she named the fact to herself that night in her own narrow bed with the plain, unsentimental honesty her father had raised her to, and set out, like a surveyor ruling a page, the exact hopeless dimensions of the case, that he was a duke and she a hired surveyor at 120 pounds the season, that the county already had her half a fortune hunter for the crime of sitting late with a grieving widower, that his name would not be his own again until Creed was brought down and proved, and that a woman with any sense would finish the survey, take her wages, and go. And having ruled the page and proved to her own satisfaction that the account could never balance, Rachel Vane blotted it, closed the book on it, and went on loving him anyway. Because arithmetic, her father used to say, is a good servant and a bad master, and there was a driven heading 40 fathoms down that would not measure itself. It took Rachel and Davy Otley 4 further descents, spread across the last 2 weeks of November, to follow the driven heading to its end, working always with a second man now stationed at the pit bank and a strict hour set for their return. For the Duke would not hear of her going below without that second safeguard again, and on the 4th descent, past the worst of the old flood water which had been drawn down by a hired pump the Duke set running the very week Rachel brought him her findings. They came at last to the heading's end, and found there not the empty rock Rachel had half expected, but a seam of coal running broad and black and untouched, a seam that showed on no plan in the estate office, older by far than her father's own trade could remember, a seam that Davy Otley, running his hand along its clean, unworked face with something like reverence, said in 20 years underground he had never once heard spoken of. And Rachel understood then the whole shape of the theft, that Absalom Creed, managing the pit for 10 trusted years, had come upon some old record or some accident of the ground that told him this rich, unrecorded seam lay just beyond the barrier the Duke's grandfather had left standing, and had seen in it not a discovery to be reported and shared with his employer, but a fortune to be quietly mined and quietly sold. Coal that existed on no plan could be dug and carted and sold with no rent paid to any duke and no wages entered in any book, and she understood too why he had needed the barrier to look, from every plan and every surface reading, exactly as thick and as sound as he had always sworn it, for a barrier shown thin on paper would have brought a proper surveyor down to ask why, and a proper surveyor below ground would have found his secret heading in an afternoon. What Creed had not reckoned with, she said to the Duke that same night, laying out her chain measurements and her bearings on the long table, was the old water behind the barrier itself, for the barrier had been left at its full grandfatherly thickness for a reason, the ground beyond it standing at a pressure no living man had ever measured, because no living man had ever needed to. And Creed, cutting his heading thin and careful from the working side, had misjudged, by some few feet only, how much rock he dared leave between his secret seam and that old standing water. And one November night the last few feet had simply let go, and the fortune he had been so carefully and so patiently stealing had come down the heading he had cut for it, and drowned 13 men who had never in there lives so much as heard of the seam that killed them. It was Davy Otley, again, who supplied the last piece, for once he understood what he had seen he began, quietly and without any prompting from Rachel, to talk to the other survivors of the old crew, the ones who had been on the bank that night or spared by illness or age, and he came to her within the week with a fact that turned suspicion into certainty, that a Newcastle coal factor's clerk, cousin to one of the bank men, had let slip in his cups the autumn before the flood that Mr. Creed did a private trade in a very particular Bright House coal that never came through the Ashcombe weighbridge at all, sold at a shade under the market rate to a certain colliery combine got up by a Mr. Josiah Price, a man with ironworks in the county and a reputation for asking no questions of a cheap cargo, and that the arrangement, whatever it was, had stopped dead the very week of the flood, and had never, so far as the clerk knew, been heard of since, which told Rachel that Creed, dismissed and disgraced in the county's eyes as the agent whose figures had killed 13 men, a disgrace he had borne with remarkable equanimity for a man supposedly ruined by it, had lost nothing at all that truly mattered to him but the seam itself, buried again under a fresh fall of rock and a full year of pumping, and that he had spent the 20 months since not in penitence but in patience, waiting, she was persuaded, for the day the grieving Duke, unable to bear the sight of his own pit, would abandon and seal it forever, at which point a seam nobody living could any longer prove existed on any honest plan would lie there quietly under abandoned ground until Mr. Creed, or Mr. Price, or the pair of them together, could contrive in a year or two's time to acquire the mineral lease for a price that reflected nothing of what lay beneath it. And it was true, she found on asking, that the Duke had indeed been heard, more than once in the county, to speak of sealing the pit forever rather than ever raise another corve from ground that had swallowed 13 of his own men, a grief-driven intention that Creed, she now understood, had been quietly and patiently encouraging through every intermediary he could reach, condoling with tenants, murmuring to the vicar, always sorrowful, always urging that his grace be let alone in so natural and Christian a resolve. And Rachel said to the Duke, the night she laid this whole chain before him, that if he sealed the pit now he would be doing, out of grief, the very last thing Mr. Creed had spent 2 years and 13 lives trying to arrange, and the Duke of Ashcombe, who had indeed been on the point of instructing his own lawyers to that effect, sat with his head in his hands a long while, and then said that he would rather cut off his own arm than do Creed one more service, however unknowing, and asked her, in a voice gone quiet with something that was not only grief anymore, what she would have him do instead. She told him, and the plan grew between them over the following fortnight the way the pit's own new pumps had grown, a little at a time, tested at every joint before the next was added, that the pit must not be sealed but reopened, publicly, with the mines inspector himself brought down from Durham to view the sealed heading and the unrecorded seam with his own eyes before witnesses, that Mr. Creed, and if he could be tempted into the county at all, Mr. Price, must be given some plausible reason to believe the old workings were at last to be abandoned for good, so that whatever remained of their arrangement, any paper, any renewed proposal for the mineral rights, any unwise word of self-congratulation, might be drawn out into the light before it occurred to either man that the ground had already been read and understood, and that the whole of the county which had buried 13 men and tried a Duke without a jury must be made to stand at the pit bank itself, in the plainest possible daylight, and be shown, not told, what a scrupulous eye had found 40 fathoms under their own certainty. It was in these weeks of quiet, careful building, the letters drafted and redrafted, the inspector's visit arranged under cover of an ordinary routine inquiry, Davy Otley coached gently in exactly what he would swear to and no more, that Rachel Vane and the Duke of Ashcombe passed, though neither said so then, the easiest and the happiest days either of them had known in years. For there is a particular intimacy in two people bent together over a single true purpose that neither dares yet call by its right name. And she found that he had, without either of them remarking it, taken to standing at her shoulder rather than across the table when they studied the plans, that his hand and hers reached often for the same pencil and drew back at the same instant that he had begun, in the small, ordinary matter of an evening, to ask her opinion on things that had nothing to do with coal, the boys' lessons, a tenant's rent, a hedge that wanted laying, as a man asks the opinion of someone whose judgment he has come simply, wholly to trust, and once, coming in from the pit bank in a hard November rain, with his hair plastered flat and his boots black to the knee, he stood in the estate office doorway shaking the wet from his coat and said, before he could stop himself, "This house has not felt like a house in 2 years, and I find I know exactly the day it began to again," and looked at her. One long, unguarded look that told her he had asked himself precisely why and had not needed to ask twice. And Rachel bent over her chain book and ruled a line she had to rule again the next morning. And the rails between them held, but they sang, the way iron sings before a change of weather. And there was, in that same quiet fortnight, one further mercy she had not looked for Edwin, coming often now to the estate office to turn his little brass wheel while his father and Miss Vane bent over their papers, began at last to understand, in the plain, unclouded way children understand a thing once it is put before them honestly, that his father had not killed anyone, that a wicked man had done a wicked thing in secret and hidden it where no one, not his father, not the whole coalfield, could have seen it. And the boy, absorbing this the way he absorbed everything, without ceremony and without half measures, marched himself down to the vicarage school the very next Sunday, and told Sam, in front of the whole yard of boys, that his father had not drowned anybody, that Miss Vane had found the true villain 40 fathoms down and would prove it before the whole county, and that Sam could believe him or not as he chose, but it was so, and came home with a bloodied lip from the disbelieving that followed, and a look of such fierce, vindicated pride that the Duke, cleaning the cut himself with his own handkerchief in the estate office that evening, laughed. One short, astonished sound, the first laugh Mrs. Prentice had heard in that house in 2 years, and said to Rachel over the boy's tousled head that between the 3 of them they seemed to be making rather a habit of proving the coalfield wrong. The county did not, of course, let so much quiet industry pass without its own uncharitable verdict, for a duke and a hired surveyor bent together night after night over a lamplit table are, to the idle eye, a scandal, waiting only for a name. And the name was supplied, in the first week of December, by Lady Fenwick of Codbeck Grange, a handsome managing widow who had for 2 seasons past nursed a settled expectation of becoming the second Duchess of Ashcombe herself, and had watched that expectation curdle by slow and public degrees, and who called at the hall one raw afternoon on the thin pretext of returning a book she had never in truth borrowed, and swept unannounced into the estate office to find Rachel alone at the long table with the Duke's own annotated survey open beside her chain book, her sleeves turned back and coal dust still faintly gray at her knuckles from the morning's descent, and took in the whole scene with one long practiced glance and said, with a smile Rachel remembered for years the way one remembers frostbite, "Oh, forgive the intrusion. I had understood a surveyor was engaged here. I had not understood the engagement ran quite so late into the evenings." What Lady Fenwick said afterward in the drawing rooms of the county was not set down verbatim by anyone honest enough to own it, but its shape traveled up the hill to Ashcombe within the fortnight exactly as such things always do, riding in on the carrier's cart and the doctor's gig and the vicar's wife. And the shape of it was that the Duke of Ashcombe, not content with the ruin his own parsimony had already brought upon 13 families, had now installed at the hall a bold young person of no name and less fortune, brought up off a mining advertisement, who went down into the pit itself with him unchaperoned and sat with him alone by lamplight over chains and figures until all hours, and that whatever a decent woman was to call such an arrangement, she was very sure it was not surveying, and that the poor motherless heir, that unfortunate silent little boy, was being raised now to think it the most natural thing in the world that his father's bed and his father's business should both, in their turn, be shared with the hired help. Mrs. Prentice, grimly relaying the substance of it to Rachel over the linen book because she judged it kinder heard from a friend than from the fish cart, finished by observing that in 40 years' service she had learned that a lie about this house always traveled downhill a good deal faster than the truth could climb back up it. And Rachel Vane sat very straight, with her face burning and perfectly still, and thought, though she did not say it aloud even to Mrs. Prentice, that a woman who could go down 40 fathoms into black water to face a murderer's handiwork without her nerve once failing her, could very well bear the ill opinion of a widow who had never in her life gone lower than her own cellar stairs, and that if the price of proving a duke's innocence was a season's slander against a surveyor's daughter, she had already paid a good deal more than that to bury her own father honestly, and would count it cheap. The Duke of Ashcombe heard of Lady Fenwick's visit within the day, as he heard of everything that happened under his own roof, and came to the estate office that evening with a face gone harder than Rachel had seen it since the morning at the pit bank, and said, without preamble, that he would have Mrs. Prentice engage a respectable widow at once to sit with her of an evening, that he should have thought of it from the first and had not, being too long out of the habit of a house with any society in it to remember what society required, and that he was sorry, more sorry than he could easily say, that his own name, already once ruined by one liar, should now be permitted to cost her anything at all. And Rachel, setting down her pen, told him plainly that she had not crossed 2 counties and gone down a flooded pit 4 times to be frightened off her own good name by a widow with a grudge, and that a chaperone was welcome if it eased the house's peace, but that she would not have him imagine, even for an evening, that she regretted 1 hour of the work, whatever Codbeck Grange chose to call it, and the Duke looked at her a long moment across the lamplit table with something in his locked face that had not been there at the pit bank, something that was not gratitude and was not merely respect either, and said only, very low, that he had begun to think there was not a great deal in this world that could frighten Miss Vane off anything she had set her mind to, and Rachel said that he was very nearly right, and went back to her chain book, and neither of them said anything further. But the rails between them, which had only sung before, began that evening to sound very like a single clear note held a long while in the cold air. The letter that drew Absalom Creed back to Ashcombe for the last time was of the Duke's own composing, though Rachel had a hand in every line of it, and it said only, with perfect and deliberate truth, that His Grace, after long and painful consideration, had resolved to seal the old northern workings permanently, and abandon that quarter of the pit forever, that the mines inspector was to attend on the 9th of December to witness the sealing and certify it for the government's books, and that Mr. Creed, as the gentleman who had managed that ground longest and knew its workings best, was invited, purely as a matter of proper form and old association, to be present when the final plans were sworn. An invitation so exactly calculated to Creed's own vanity and his own buried hope that he answered it, Davy Otley's Newcastle informant reported with some satisfaction, within 2 days, and word came separately, through the same careful channels, that a Mr. Josiah Price of the Price Iron Works had taken rooms at the very same coaching inn in Ashcombe Denay for the same week, on business he did not trouble to specify, which the Duke read aloud to Rachel across the estate office table with a grim satisfaction that was, she thought, the nearest thing to joy she had yet seen in him. The 9th of December came in hard and bright, a rare clean frost after weeks of northern rain, and what the coalfield saw, converging on foot and in gigs and carts from every pit village for 10 miles, Because a government inspector coming to view a haunted working is not an event a coalfield declines to attend, was the whole apparatus of Ashcombe Hall turned out for the first time in 2 years, the shutters of the west front thrown back, the great winding wheel garlanded, absurdly and movingly, by the pit women themselves, with whatever greenery December allowed, and at the pit bank a long trestle table set up in the open, frosty air. For Rachel had insisted, over Mrs. Prentice's objections, that no lady's business was ever conducted out of doors in December, that if the pit had been the scene of the wrong, it must also be the scene of the reckoning, and that the county, which had passed its first verdict from the comfort of a drawing-room, owed the second one the discomfort of standing on the very ground it had judged. The mines inspector, a dry, precise government man named Mr. Sherard, who had seen a great many collieries and was not disposed to be astonished by any of them, arrived promptly at 11 and was received by the Duke with a formality that gave nothing away, and Absalom Creed arrived a half-hour after, in his good gig, dressed in decent black as befit so solemn an occasion, wearing the easy, sorrowful face of a man come to see old grief laid finally to rest, and greeted the inspector, and greeted the Duke, and only faltered, very slightly, when he saw Rachel Vane standing at the trestle table with her chain book and her bearings set out before her, and Davy Otley standing a little apart with 2 other survivors of the old crew, men Creed had once commanded and dismissed at will, none of them now looking at their boots the way colliers are taught to look at their boots before a gentleman, but looking, every one of them, straight at him. Mr. Price, sent for by a note the Duke's own agent had carried to the inn that morning, arrived a few minutes later still, a stout choleric man who plainly had not expected to be summoned to a pit bank in the frost, and said so. And Creed's easy face, seeing him come up the track, went for the first time that morning the color of the frost itself. And it was at that moment, with the whole trestle laid out, and the inspector's pen already uncapped, and the county's foremost families drawn up in a wide, curious ring at a respectful distance, that the Duke of Ashcombe rose from his place at the table and said, in a voice pitched to carry to the furthest cart, that before any plan was sworn or any working sealed, his own surveyor had certain findings to lay before the inspector and before the county, and that he asked every person present to hear her out in full before a single spadeful of earth went into that shaft. Rachel Vane stood up in the cold, bright light with her chain book in her 2 hands, and she did not hurry, because thoroughness had been her father's religion before it was hers, and she laid out, plate by plate, the old plan of the Duke's grandfather with its true recorded thickness for the barrier, and beside it the plan Mr. Creed himself had sworn to 10 years before, with a thickness a full 3rd greater. And she said, in the level carrying voice that had once read a hillside and now read a silent crowd with the same unhurried confidence, that a chain does not lie and a bearing does not flatter, and that she and the deputy Davy Otley had gone below 4 times in the last month and had measured, fathom by fathom, a heading driven clean through that barrier from the working side, timbered in wood no more than 2 or 3 years felled, running straight and deliberate to a rich unrecorded seam that showed on no plan sworn to any inspector before this hour. And she called Davy Otley forward, and the broad, slow-spoken deputy, who had spent 20 years learning to look at his boots before gentlemen, stood up straight instead and swore, in his own plain words, to being taken off his rounds 2 years before the flood, and set to work above ground for a fortnight, while 2 strange hired men worked below with no deputy over them but Mr. Creed himself, and Mr. Sherard the inspector, who had come prepared for a routine sealing, and found himself instead the presiding officer of something very like a trial, took the 2 plans in his own hands and held them to the light, and asked Mr. Creed directly to account for the discrepancy in his own sworn figure. And it was at that question, with the whole coalfield silent in the frost and Mr. Price already backing his heavy self away from Creed's side as a man backs away from a house on fire, that Absalom Creed's easy, sorrowful face came off like ice cracking on a pond, and he said something wild about a young woman's incompetence and a deputy's grudge, too loud, his voice cracking upward in a way his listeners had never once heard from him in 10 confident years, and made, in his rising panic, the one fatal admission a guilty man always makes when he is not yet ready to be caught. He said that the seam beyond the barrier had never been proved rich enough to trouble anyone with. A seam, the inspector observed quietly, laying down his pen, that Mr. Creed had just now, unasked, admitted to knowing existed at all, though he had sworn 10 years running that the ground beyond the barrier held nothing but old water, and the crowd, the whole assembled coalfield that had buried its dead in one bitter November week and passed its verdict without a jury, made a sound then that Rachel never afterward forgot. Not a cheer. Nothing so simple as a cheer, but a long, low murmur of 100 people all arriving at the same understanding in the same instant, the sound of a county's certainty breaking up like river ice in a thaw. What followed went fast, as such collapses do. Mr. Sherrod, the inspector, whose government commission gave him authority enough for the moment, directed that Mr. Creed be detained until the county magistrate could be sent for, and Mr. Creed, white now and shaking, tried first bluster, and then, worse for him, tried to buy his way clear in front of 100 witnesses, turning on Mr. Price and saying loudly that the ironmaster had known everything and taken his share of every cargo, which Mr. Price, purple with fury at being named before his own county, denied with an energy that convinced nobody who had watched him go pale not 5 minutes before. And the two of them were still disputing which had ruined the other when the Duke's own grooms, at a word from their master, took charge of both, and the Duke of Ashcombe, standing very straight at the head of his own trestle table, with the true and the false plans both in the inspector's hands, looked out at last over the frozen ring of faces, the tenants, the freeholders, the widows in their black shawls, the very families who had watched him walk the pit bank alone for 20 months and called it the guilt of a murderer, and said, in a voice that carried to the last cart on the track, that he did not ask the county's pardon, for he had done nothing that wanted pardoning. He asked only that they had heard, with their own ears and from an honest chain and an honest deputy's mouth, the truth that a wicked man had bought 2 years of quiet by letting a grieving father believe his own frugality had killed 13 men, and that the frugality was never the cause. The barrier had been murdered as surely as the men who died behind it. And he turned then before the whole assembled coalfield, and looked at Rachel Vane standing very straight in the cold with her chain book still in her hands, and said that if any person here wished to know whose eye and whose courage had gone down into that black water 4 times, to find the truth the whole county had been too certain to look for, they need look no further than his own surveyor. And there was, at that, from the pit women especially, who understood better than any gentry present exactly what going down that particular pit 4 times had cost in nerve, a sound that was very like a cheer after all. What the assizes made of Absalom Creed, in the slow grinding way of the law, was a transportation for 14 years. For the theft of coal and the falsifying of a sworn plan were crimes the courts understood a good deal better than they understood grief. And Mr. Josiah Price, though he talked his own way out of the worst of it by turning government evidence against his former partner in trade, found his ironworks shunned by every decent contract in the county thereafter, and removed himself, within the 12-month, to some other coalfield where his name was not yet a byword. And the coalfield that had buried 13 men in one bitter week and blamed a grieving duke for their deaths without ever troubling to send so much as a boy below to look at the barrier itself, did what such places always do once the truth has been forced upon them past all denying. It repented loudly, and remembered aloud in every public house from Newcastle to the Tees that it had always privately doubted the story, always thought there was more to his grace than the talk aloud, which was not. Rachel privately observed to the Duke quite the same thing as having said so at the time, and the Duke, who had discovered in himself no great appetite for holding a grudge against a whole coalfield that had, after all, buried its own dead honestly even if it had judged him unjustly, said only that a man who has been given back his name has very little time left over for counting who was slow to return it. The pit itself was reopened in the spring, properly this time, with a new pumping engine ordered and paid for within the month. The old sealed heading filled and mortared under Rachel's own supervision, so that no man need ever again go near ground that had once drowned 13 of his fellows, and the rich seam beyond it, surveyed at last honestly, and entered on an honest plan under Rachel Vane's own hand, witnessed and sworn before Mr. Sherrod, was worked from that day as openly as any coal in the county, the profit of it going first and largest to a fund for the widows and the orphans of the 13. A disposition the Duke insisted upon, and Rachel drew up the deed for herself, in a hand her father would have been proud to own, and Davy Otley was made head deputy of the whole colliery before the year was out, a promotion the coalfield agreed, for once without argument, was earned 3 times over. It was on an evening in that same reopening spring, with the new engine's first steady beat carrying up faintly from the pit bank through an open window, and Edwin asleep at last after an afternoon spent proudly showing every visiting gentleman his own small brass model of the wheel, that the Duke of Ashcombe found Rachel Vane alone on the terrace above the resurrected rose beds that Mrs. Prentice and 2 hired gardeners had spent the whole of March coaxing back to life, and stood beside her a while in the particular good silence that had been theirs since the very first wet gray morning at the pit bank. And then he said that he was instructed by no lawyer and prompted by no letter, that he had carried a sentence about with him since a November morning 40 fathoms underground, when a young woman had come up out of the dark to tell him his own grief had been a lie, and that he had not been able to say it while his name was still a stranger's plaything, and he had nothing to offer a woman but a scandal, and that his name was his own again now, bought back at a cost he would not soon forget, and that he found the having of it worth very little unless she would consent to share it. And Rachel Vane, who had faced down poverty and a coalfield slander and a 40-fathom flood without her voice once failing her, discovered that it had failed her now, and answered him the way the truest measurements are always given, plainly, and the answer was yes. They were married at the little stone chapel in Ashcombe Denay in the first week of June, quietly, though half the coalfield contrived some errand that took it past the church door that morning all the same. And Edwin stood up with them and held, with terrible 8-year-old solemnity, the ring, and afterward, the whole county that could beg the smallest excuse came up to a house that blazed, for the first time in 3 years, with light in every one of its 100 windows. The dust sheets gone. The ballroom opened and danced in until 2 in the morning, and if there were those among the dancing guests who had a year before called the Duke of Ashcombe a murderer over their own dinner tables, why he found he had, in the end, no great use for remembering it against them, having discovered something a good deal better to do with the years that were left to him. As for Rachel, she did not give up her trade, whatever the coronet, holding it firmly and stating it often, over the objections of exactly no one who mattered, that a duchess with an idle chain and an idle level was a duchess wasted, and within 2 years there was, upon the Ashcombe estate, a proper school of practical surveying for the sons and daughters of the pit villages, boys and girls both, for she had not forgotten what it cost a girl to be told her father's whole trade was of no value in her hands, taught out of a fund she herself had helped establish. And old Ezra Coldwell, brought up from Durham to be its first master, wept without shame the day it opened, and said that he had trained one surveyor in his long life worth remembering, and had lived, past all his own hoping, to see her found out at last. And if you should ever come north, past the gray coalfield villages and up the avenue where the new planted trees are only now beginning to shade the road, you would find Ashcombe Hall lit most evenings, the winding wheel turning steady and honest above an honest seam. The estate office still busy of an evening with plans and chains, and a duke who has learned to read his own ground and no longer needs another man's word for what lies beneath his feet. And in the schoolroom by day the sound of children being taught a trade the world once told a woman she could not carry. And if the house could speak, it would tell you what the new engine and the reopened seam and the rebuilt roses all know, that a grief unexamined will let a guilty man walk free behind it forever, and that the ground, though it climbs slowly into the light, always climbs, and that a great house is only ever as buried as the lie built into its own foundations, and rises all at once the day somebody goes down with a true chain and measures it out to the last inch. So tell me, before you go, which confident verdict of the world you have seen overturned in your own life, and whether there is a wrong in your own story that wanted only an honest measurement and the courage to go down and take it. And tell me, too, where you are listening from tonight, and what the weather is doing there. Because I ask everyone who comes to this fireside, and I read every answer that comes back. And now, one last picture to carry with you. A great blackened house above a working pit on a June evening, every window gold against the falling dusk, the new engine beating steady as a heart in the near dark. And on the terrace above the roses a tall man unbent at last, and a straight-backed young woman with coal still faintly gray in the lines of her capable hands, her fingers laced now in his instead of around a chain. The whole slandered past measured, proven, and laid finally to rest behind them, and below them the lamps of the reopened village burning warm and steady toward morning, like small honest lights that had simply been waiting, all this while, for someone brave enough to go down into the dark and bring the truth back up whole.